A quiet woman returned 12 horses and asked for nothing in return. The count was off by morning. I knew before I reached the south gate. The way the dust lay wrong in the yard, too still, no milling, no breath fog rising off a herd bedded near the fence. 41 years I'd been getting up in the dark to check that yard, and the air told you things before your eyes caught up. 12 horses gone. The gate latch busted clean at the post, not bent, cut. Someone who knew the ranch or someone who'd watched it long enough to learn it. I stood in the cold with my lantern and counted the remaining ones 3 times. 22 left, and the 12 missing were not the culls. They were the working stock, the 5-year-old Grullo I'd spent 2 summers gentling, the pair of matched bays I'd trained to drive, and 9 others that were the spine of everything I ran. A man in his 60s doesn't rebuild a herd like that. Not in this country, not on this soil. My neighbor Prout rode out that same morning, not to help, to look. He stood at the gate with his hat back on his head and made a sound in his throat like a man pricing a carcass. "Well," he said, "that's a hard thing, Aldous." I didn't answer him. I was already mapping the track marks in the mud east of the fence. The sheriff Beckman came out by midday. He wrote in his ledger and looked at the tracks and said they'd likely crossed into the territory by now, which was his way of telling me it was finished without saying so out loud. He shook my hand like he was sorry at a funeral and rode back to town. I tracked east alone for 3 days. I found where they'd pushed the horses hard, found 1 set of boot prints in a dry creek bed, found an old fire ring with horse dung nearby. Then the trail broke apart where they'd split the animals and the ground went rocky, and I lost it. I came back with 22 horses and nothing else. What people in a valley do when a man suffers a loss is they come around for a week. They bring food and they stand in the yard and they say the right things, and then they go back to their own work and the loss becomes yours alone to carry. I understood that. I didn't hold it against anyone. A stolen herd is not a fire, nothing's burned, nothing's visibly ruined. To the outside, a ranch with 22 horses is still a ranch. But I knew the math. I knew what those 12 animals meant for what I could work through a season, what I could sell at market, what I could take on in the way of hired help and equipment. I'd borrowed against a good year to improve the south pasture fencing the previous autumn. The loan was not catastrophic, but it required the kind of revenue I could no longer produce. And I was 63 years old, alone on this land for 11 years since my wife passed, with 2 sons who'd moved east and called on holidays. I did not tell anyone the specifics. It is a particular kind of pride, not the good kind, I know, but when a man has built something from nothing and watched it stand for 4 decades, he does not easily open the ledger to his neighbors. I kept working, took on some fence repair for Prout, which burned in my chest every morning I rode his fence line, but I took it. Scaled back my own operation to what 22 horses could carry. Ate simply. Slept poorly. Spent a lot of evenings with a lamp on the table and the account book open, running figures that never added up quite right. The valley had a version of me in their heads. Old Aldous Crane, the horseman, been there forever, stubborn as a fence post. I let them keep it. I did not correct the picture. You do what you can to preserve the thing people have always expected of you, because the day you stop being that thing, you stop being anything at all. Or that's what I believed then. Her name was Nora Vasquez. She'd come to the valley 2 years before any of this, a widow from further south, bought the Hennessy place at the end of the East Road, about 4 miles from my gate. I knew her the way you know most of your neighbors out here, by sight at the feed store, by the smoke from her chimney in winter, by the occasional nod when we passed each other on the road to town. Quiet woman, kept to herself. Ran a modest operation, a milk cow, some chickens, a kitchen garden that was noticeably well kept even from the road. She had a hired man who worked her place 3 days a week, a taciturn Tejano named Felix who everybody respected. I'd spoken to her maybe a dozen words in 2 years. She wasn't unfriendly. She just didn't put herself forward, and I had no occasion to put myself toward her. When the horses were taken, she brought a pie to the house, set it on the porch without knocking, left before I came out. I found it with a cloth over it and no note. Assumed it was one of the church women, didn't think more about it. I found out later it was her. 6 weeks after the theft, on a Tuesday morning in early November, I was splitting wood behind the barn when Felix rode up my road. He pulled up at a polite distance and waited until I put them all down. "Mrs. Vasquez asks if you'd come to her place," he said. "What for?" He didn't answer that, just held his hat and waited. Something about the way he sat the horse told me it wasn't a social call. I put on my coat and rode with him. We came around the back of the Hennessy place and into the south paddock, and there were horses. Not just any horses. 12 horses. I pulled up and sat very still in the saddle for a long moment. The Grullo was there, the one I'd spent 2 summers on, standing in the far corner of the paddock with his ears up, watching me. The 2 matched bays were there, all 12. Nora Vasquez was standing by the paddock fence in her work clothes, a canvas coat with the collar up against the wind. She had her arms folded and her eyes on the horses. She didn't look at me when I rode up. I got down slowly. I checked each animal with my eyes. I walked the fence line and looked them over. They were thinner than I'd have liked, but sound. No injuries I could see. The Grullo came to the fence and put his nose near my hand. I didn't say anything for a while. "How?" I finally said. She turned and looked at me then. She had dark eyes, steady in that way some people have where you understand that not much rattles them. "I followed the same track you followed east," she said. Then I kept going. Alone. Felix came with me when he could. But mostly alone. I looked at the horses again, then back at her. "How long did it take you?" 5 weeks. 5 weeks. I stood there with that number and I could not fit it into the shape of what I understood about people. 5 weeks, following a stolen herd into territory she didn't know, on her own time and her own money, for a neighbor she'd spoken a dozen words to in 2 years. "How much did it cost you?" I said. "That's not relevant." "It is to me." She was quiet. "A little," she said. "Not much. I'm a good negotiator." Which told me she'd paid something to someone to release them, to whoever ended up holding the animals at the end of that trail, and she wasn't going to tell me what. "I'll pay you back," I said. "No, you won't." "Nora." "I didn't do it to be paid back." She said it plainly. Not hard, not soft, just a fact. "I did it because they were your horses and it was wrong that they were taken." I had nothing to say to that. I'm not a man who cries, haven't been since my wife's funeral, but I felt something shift in my chest standing in that cold paddock that I hadn't felt in a long time. The Grullo was watching me over the fence rail. The bays stood together the way they always did. "You could have sent word," I said, "when you found them." "I could have." "Why didn't you?" She looked at me steadily. "Because I wanted to give them back to you myself," she said. "And I wanted to be sure they were yours before I made that ride." I don't know how to explain what happens to a man when someone does something like that for him. Not a man my age, anyway. When you're young, you think people do good things for each other out of kindness or habit or because the community expects it. When you're older, you understand that real effort, real cost, comes from something else. It comes from deciding that someone matters enough to spend something real on them. Time. Risk. The contents of your own pocket. She had looked at me across 2 years of near silence and made a decision I hadn't even known she was making. She'd decided I was worth something. Not Aldous Crane, the institution, not the man with the reputation, not the landmark of the valley. She didn't know any of that, really. She decided that the man she saw was worth 12 horses and 5 weeks of her life. I put my horses in my own paddock that afternoon, one by one. I checked each one over properly, feet, teeth, condition, and the Grullo stayed near me the whole time, which he didn't usually do with anyone but me. I put fresh hay in the feeder and stood in the barn long after there was anything left to do. I went back to her place the following Sunday. I'd thought a long time about what to bring, not food that felt wrong, not money she'd already told me. I finally brought 2 cords of wood, split and stacked on my wagon, because I'd noticed her woodpile was low and winter was coming and she lived alone, and that was a real thing she needed. Felix helped me stack it along the south side of her barn, and she came out halfway through and watched us and didn't argue. When we were done, she brought coffee out and we sat on her porch in the cold. Felix went to check on something and left us there. "The horses are in good condition," I said, "better than I expected." Felix knows livestock. "So do you, I think." She looked out at her paddock. She had a good horse of her own, a dark red mare with a white blaze. "My husband ran cattle," she said. I paid attention. We sat quietly for a while, the kind of quiet that doesn't need to be filled. "You lost your husband how long ago?" I said. 4 years. "You came here to start over." "I came here because the land was affordable and the water was good and I was tired of pity." She said it without bitterness, just the facts of a decision she'd made. People look at a widow a long time. I didn't want to be looked at that way anymore. I understood that completely. The way people look at what you used to be, what you used to have. The way they make you into a monument to your own loss. "How much longer do you think you'll stay?" I asked. She looked at me. "I hadn't planned to leave," she said. I nodded. We drank our coffee. "I want to pay you back for the horses," I said when the cups were empty. "Not in money, but in something real." "Aldous." "I'm not asking permission," I said. "I'm telling you what I'm going to do. It'll be useful things, things you actually need. You'll have to tolerate it." She looked at me a long moment, and I had the feeling she was reading something in my face that I hadn't put there on purpose. "All right," she said. "I want to be honest about what came next, because it didn't happen the way things happen in stories. It didn't happen fast, and there wasn't a single day where everything turned. It happened in the way that real things happen across months, in small accumulations, through tasks done alongside each other and conversations held while hands were busy. I came back with tools the following week and fixed a gate hinge she'd been working around. She brought food to my place when she came to look at a horse she was interested in buying, not the 12, one of my others, a good steady mare she thought would suit her. I gave her a fair price. She accepted it without theatrics, which I respected. Felix helped me pull a stuck fence post in January, and I fed them both supper afterward. We were not young people doing young people things. We were 2 people in their 60s figuring out what it looks like when you start again. It looks like work done near each other. It looks like coffee on a cold porch. It looks like knowing when to talk and when not to. Somewhere in that long winter, I stopped dreading the account book. Not because the numbers changed overnight, they didn't, but because I had my horses back and I had my footing back, and something about those 2 facts settled in me and let me think straight again. I renegotiated the fence loan with the bank in March, got different terms, made it workable, brought 2 horses to market in the spring that sold better than I'd expected, started to see the year as something I could get through rather than something that was happening to me. I started going to church again, not for religion exactly, more because Nora went and I wanted to be in the same place she was on Sunday mornings. In April, Prout rode over to offer me a contract for some braking work, which was a better offer than the fence repair had been, and I took it, and he stood in my yard and looked around and said something had changed about the place. "Horses look good," he said. "They're back to condition," I said. He squinted at me. "You seem different." I thought about that, maybe. He waited for more, and when I didn't give him any he nodded and rode out. What I didn't tell him was this. Something had come back to me that I thought was gone. Not the herd. The herd was a practical thing, a tool of living. I mean something else. The feeling that there was a point to the whole enterprise, to getting up in the dark and going out to check the yard and counting animals in the cold. A man can do those things out of habit for a long time, and the habit will sustain him. But it is not the same as believing in the work. Somewhere in those 11 years alone, I had drifted from belief to habit without noticing. It took a woman I barely knew spending 5 weeks of her life on my behalf to show me the difference. She didn't tell me I mattered. She showed me, in the plainest way possible, in effort, in time, in cost, and it hit different than words ever would have. It was June when she let me hold her hand. We were sitting on my porch in the evening, which had become a habit by then, both of us watching the Grullo run in the south pasture. He liked to run at dusk. I'd always thought he was showing off for nobody in particular, but lately I'd revised that opinion. She was sitting in the other chair and she reached over and put her hand on the back of mine, where it rested on the chair arm. That was all. She just put her hand there. I turned mine over and closed it around hers. We sat like that while the Grullo ran himself down and came back to the fence and shook out his mane and went still. "I want to tell you something," she said. "All right. When I followed those horses, I wasn't doing it for the community." She paused. "I was doing it because I'd watched you work for 2 years and I knew what those animals meant to you, and I thought someone ought to do something about it." Another pause, and no one else was going to. I looked at her in the evening light, her face in profile, plain and good. "I know," I said. "I didn't want you to think it was charity." "I never thought that." She nodded. She kept her hand in mine. "I just wanted you to know," she said, "that I saw what kind of man you were, before any of this. I saw it and I thought it was a shame that no one was standing next to you." I didn't answer that. I couldn't have said anything that was worth saying. So I just sat there with her hand in mine, and the Grullo breathing quietly at the fence and the last light going off the hills to the west, and I let it settle in me the way good things settle slowly, all the way down. The valley knew eventually, the way valleys always know. Pruitt saw my wagon at her place, often enough that he stopped pretending not to notice. Mrs. Callahan at the feed store gave us a particular look in August that told me she'd already told 6 people. I didn't mind. I had moved past the age where what people thought of my life had any real claim on me. What I minded about and tended carefully was the life itself. Nora kept her place and I kept mine. We didn't talk about changing that, not that year. There was no rush and no need for one. I rode to her place on Sunday mornings and we went to church and came back and had dinner, and the afternoon was its own thing, unhurried, full of the small satisfactions of 2 people who are glad to be in the same room. She read in the evenings. I did my accounts. Felix came and went and treated me like a fixture, which was its own kind of welcome. My sons called in the fall. I told them I had a friend who'd done me a considerable good turn and that things were going well. The oldest wanted to know more, and I told him there wasn't much more to tell yet. He knew from my voice that there was. I remember the morning in October when I got up and went out to the yard and counted horses in the dark and came up right. 34 now. I'd added 2 good ones in the summer, and went back inside and made coffee and stood at the window, watching the light come up, and felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Not happiness exactly. Happiness is a young man's word for something too simple. What I felt was more like rightness, like the weight of things was distributed correctly. Like the whole operation, the work, the land, the animals, the early dark and the cold coffee and the creak of this old house, had a point. Nora's mare was in the paddock nearest the house because she'd left her the night before rather than trailer her home in the dark. The mare was facing east, ears up, catching the first heat of the sun on her face. She stood that way for a long time, patient and still and complete in herself. I thought about 12 horses gone, and a woman I didn't know deciding that mattered. I thought about all the ways a man can be mistaken about what he's worth. I poured my coffee and sat down and let the morning come.